Hi everyone, Professor King here. In this video, I'm going to be talking for English 102. We're going to be discussing and continuing our discussion of various literary elements that can be found. Today we're not starting a unit, we're kind of taking the unit that we began on parables, and now we're looking at poetry. So it's kind of like both of those genres will be contained within this unit. So I'll be taking it to a share screen as usual in a moment, but one thing I always like to remind you before I start going is that you should follow along, take breaks, etc., stop, rewind where you need to stop and rewind. I've said before about like analysis and slowing down. Now that we're moving into poetry, we can really honor that idea of slowing down, because the parables were a relatively easy read, and at least one of them is told as essentially like a short story. But with poetry, and we'll talk about this at greater length in a moment, poetry really requires that you slow down and you look at each individual word, and then you look at how the words interact with one another, right? So let me take it to the share screen. And let me go to where we are now. If you remember, we ended on symbolism last time. So today we're just at the next step in the game, which is poetry. So we've already talked about parables. We've talked a little bit about fables and allegories in relation to parables. And so we finished the parables from last week. Now we're going to go into some poems. All right. So what is poetry? Well, poetry is a genre of literature in which the aesthetics of emotion and thought are given precedence. This is done through the use of style and rhythm. And it doesn't have to be the same style or the same rhythm for every single poem, as you'll see in the selections for this week. But there has to be deliberate use of style and rhythm. Just like when we talked about how to read, right? And I mentioned, that every writer with every piece of work that they create, every single word in there is deliberate. And for poetry, that is, it may not be true for, what am I trying to say? It's the most true, in a sense, for poetry of all the literary genres, because you're dealing with typically, right, less space on the page, fewer words, more of a centralized idea as opposed to a narrative, even though poems can have narratives. And so there's this really, again, this focus on really slowing down and absorbing and figuring out what's going on, and then looking at what the subtext is. So poetry can be rhyming or unrhyming, right? Most poetry up until the mid 20th century was metered out. It was rhyming in a way that like most music is, right? It has a flow, it has a very specific structure. We have things, from early poetry like iambic pentameter, which is, 5 sets of unstressed stressed syllables that rhyme at the end. So we have that, but then we also have, in sort of the post, the eras after modernism. I don't want to say postmodernist because that evokes a sort of different meaning, but in everything after modernism, which is early to mid 20th century, we start to see much more play on things like rhythm and rhyme and verse and what we can do with it, right? So it can be rhyming or unrhyming. It can be metered or unmetered. And what metered or unmetered means is, does it have a specific rhythm or not? It can be in verse form, It can be in prose form, or it can be in stream of consciousness form. What do those mean? What's the difference there? Well, verse is, again, that very stylized, structured, rhyming sort of poem, the traditional poem that you see, right? A prose poem is essentially a poem written in paragraph form. And we'll see, we won't see one necessarily this week, but we will see one, a form of prose poem called called The Straightforward Mermaid by Matea Harvey. Something like John Donne, that would be a classic example of verse poetry, right? Or like Shakespeare's sonnets, even Robert Browning, those are all verse poems. Matea Harvey's Matea Harvey's the Straightforward Mermaid. Another famous one, T.S. Eliot's Hysteria, right? These are examples of prose poems. Or you can have stream of consciousness poetry. And this is very common in the late modern to postmodernist era. You get a lot of just sort of, what stream of consciousness is it mimics the way that the brain comes up with ideas. So there is literally no rhyme or reason to it. Virginia Woolf has a very famous, what can be considered a stream of consciousness poem in the novel Mrs. Dalloway. She sees essentially like a homeless woman, and she, Mrs. Dalloway sees this homeless woman, I think in the subway, and she has this very fascinating sort of stream of consciousness poem centered on this woman. Samuel Beckett's done stuff with stream of consciousness, both in drama and in poetry and in prose. So it's there, right? And you get like the beats, some of the beat poets did stream of consciousness. So it's very much just sort of following the chaotic non-rhythm of our thoughts. That's what stream of consciousness looks like. And then poetry can be abstract, or it can be concrete and or narrative. And what we mean by that is, like, some poems will take on a very sort of ethereal or esoteric or even avant-garde quality to them, where they're not meant to be taken fully literally. They're not kind of telling you a story or plot. It's more about the feelings they evoke, or the symbols that they present, or the image, right, that remains indelible at the end of the poem. Sorry if you can hear whining. That's my dog Lionel. It's not ending anytime soon. So it can be abstract in that way, or it can be concrete and narrative. If you see like a lot of ballads, anything where you'll see like a ballad, those are usually concrete narrative types of poems, right? They tell a story. Songs that tell a story would be a form of concrete or narrative poetry. Where it's not just about some sort of overall abstract expression, but there's actually a plot and story going on. So just to think about what this means, it means that poetry can look a lot of different ways. It's not that it's all rhyming. It's not that it all has a structure. It's not that none of it rhymes and none of it has a structure, but really thinking about aesthetics and emotion and these sort of impressions that can be made by poetry. Those are the big takeaways from that. All right, so now we're going to talk about irony. And irony can happen in poetry. It can happen in parable. It can happen in short story. It can happen anywhere, right? And irony occurs, it can happen in drama. There's actually a literary term called dramatic irony. And essentially what irony is when there's a disconnect between essentially what is explicit and what is implicit, or what is known and what is not known. So when people say things are like ironic, right? They're usually like the Alanis Morissette song that you see the still from here. Sorry, I'm trying to quiet my dog. usually when people use the term ironic in those kinds of scenarios, it's incorrect. Because the very use of the term ironic has kind of been diluted and appropriated over the last, let's say, like 40 years, right? But really all irony is when there is a disconnect between what is uttered and what is implied, or what the character knows versus what the actual reading audience knows. Okay. So, you know, like when you watch scary movies and like the murderer is behind a door with a knife and there's like, you know, a gorgeous woman about to open the door and everyone in the audience screams, "Don't open that door, he's going to kill you." What the audience is doing, what the characters are doing, are engaging in a level of irony, because that woman does not know that the killer is behind the door. The audience does. The killer knows, but that character, the woman, she doesn't know, right? So that's an example of irony, because what she knows versus what we know is different, right? And that adds to things like suspense. It adds to things like comedic timing. It adds to plot, right? Another example, if you look at a poem like My Last Duchess, I mean, I know it's going to be a little bit of a challenge because, you know, it's written by an English guy in the early 19th century, but it's worth it. It's a good poem. Robert Browning is a sick and twisted individual, at least, you know, in terms of what his imagination can come up with in poetry. If you've ever read his stuff, you know, another really gnarly one is Porphyria's Lover. Browning, you know, he's going there with like the freaky stuff. So I hope you enjoy it. But if we think about the speaker in that poem, right, and what we kind of find out about, you know, I'm no spoilers, but what we find out about him and what happened to his last duchess and who he's talking to and why he is in the space that he is in talking to this person in the present moment. And then what we know, again, as the reading audience who's not living in this fictional world, but actually reading this fictional world as it's happening, you know, all of that plays into, again, that sort of like implied punchline, if you will, of what's going on in the subtext of that poem. The regular text too, but, you know, here's what I'll say. Once you sift through the irony and you really find out who this speaker is, then the way that you view the speaker and the way that you view the poem radically changes, right? Once you know what's going on. So keep that in mind when you're reading My Last Duchess. And then, you know, kind of building on that, if we think about audience, I talked about the rhetorical triangle previously, and so keep that in mind when you're reading poems, because, you know, there are oftentimes in literature, there are two different audiences, right? Like, because there's a narrator or speaker, and then there are the people in the work of fiction that they're speaking to. But then again, there are also the real life audience, us reading that speech or that conversation and, you know, receiving it differently than even the audience within the poem is. So what is the audience? The audience is comprised of those people, real, right? Us, the reading audience, or imagined, the fictitious people that are firsthand experiencing, you know, audiencehood, if you will, within the text, to whom the speaker of a literary work is often speaking. The audience is often, though not always, different from the person reading the text, okay? And again, if we think about a poem like My Last Duchess or The Flea, or Wild Nights, right? Think about speaker and audience. Think about who is speaking in the poem. Think about to whom they are speaking and why. Again, go back to that rhetorical triangle of author, purpose, audience, and then message, right? And then if we know that that's what's going on within the diegetic world of the poem, then we as the reading audience take a step back and say, okay, this person is saying this to this person. So now one step removed is us and the author. So the author, by creating this speaker and this audience within the poem, is then saying something to us, and we're both outside of the text, right? But we're still communicating. There's still an argument that is being formed there, an overall impression that the writer, in creating the speaker who's talking to the audience in the poem, that is being received by us, the audience outside of the poem. You know, there's layers to this stuff. It's, you know, it's fascinating. But as you read these poems, think about who the speaker is, who the audience is, what the argument within the poem is, what the argument outside of the poem is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What the purpose is, right? All right, and next we talk about tone. The tone of a work of literature reflects the speaker's or the writer's overall mood or attitude toward a specific character, subject, setting, etc. Okay. Now I want to say something that's very, very important, especially when we're looking at poetry. Try not to conflate the speaker in a poem with the author writing the poem, okay? You know, in the same way that Martin Scorsese is not Travis Bickle, right? In the same way that, you know, whoever directs the Marvel movies isn't Thanos, right? Thanatos? I don't remember. But, you know, they are people who've created these characters and these texts to get the audience, the real world audience, to feel a certain way, right? But sometimes within these texts, again, a speaker or a narrator or a character can create tone, can set a mood by what they're saying, by what they're doing. And we have to look at that. Why is this writer having this character create this tone? Why does, you know, Thanos, the guy who Josh Brolin plays, the purple guy, right? Like, why does he in those films bring a tone of like scariness, but also sadness, but also suspense, but also like a little whiff of nihilism? Why, right? Whereas, you know, the empath, I don't know if you remember the lady who plays the empath, like what, she has a much different tone, or Captain America has a different tone. Like, what do they bring and why? Okay. And then finally, it says simile, not smile. A simile compares two or more concepts, things, characters, settings, ideas, using the words like or as, right? With as, it's often coupled and separated by an adjective, right? As fresh, as a daisy, as mad, as hell, as ugly, as sin. Whereas when you're using like, you can just say like, you know, like in Dirty Dancing, when Patrick Swayze says she's like the wind, right? That would be the like version of the simile. Etta James says your love is like lighting a fire with a wet match, right? That would be a like simile. So it's comparison. And when we think about comparison in the abstract sense, in the aesthetic sense, you know, and this goes back to Nietzsche and before, what we're really doing is we are making sense of the world in an artistic way, right? This sort of analogy, right? These analogous things, they help us to understand the world creatively, right? If I say I'm as fresh as a daisy, that's going to evoke, I mean, it's a cliche, but it's going to evoke certain sensory images, right? Smell, sight, perhaps tactile, right? Whereas if I say like, you know, you're as fresh as, like, I don't know, raw eggs in a steam bath. Like, that's not going to evoke the same thing. It's going to make us think about putridness and heat and the opposite of fresh, right? So when you are looking at these similes, again, think about tone. What tone does that set by that simile being that way? Think about speaker. Who is sharing the simile? What are the things being compared, and why is that noteworthy, significant, or important? What feelings or images does a simile like this evoke, right? So these are things with these first 5 or 6 poems this week that I want you to really hold on to. I think we're good there. I want you to hold on to, because, you know, when we think about poetry, we have to think as artists, right? And I'll take it off of stop share now. There's one more thing that I want to show you in terms of some of the readings that we're going to be applying these to. I'm not trying to make life difficult for you in not sort of giving you, you know, the plot of the poems. That's your job, right? To interpret these poems and figure out what they mean. Again, do all the things that you started doing with Kafka and Tolstoy, which is like boxing unfamiliar words, defining them and rereading them in context, finding out more about historical movements or people you're not familiar with, slowing down to really get the overall impression, thinking about the time and place in which these items were written and what life, how life was probably different then than it is now. All these sorts of things, right? So I want you to keep doing all that. But one thing I want to show you, and I'll take it back to a share screen really quickly. One thing I want to show you, like, for example, oops, wrong one, is for certain poems. So we have week 3 here. I've put the poems up so far. This is going to be the video you'll watch, and then I'll have the discussion board. But all these poems have links, okay? And you can just click on the links and then they'll take you to the page. Most of these can be found in Poetry Foundation, which is like a great national sort of register of all kinds of different poems. So if you read a poet or a writer in our class that you like, you can always go to the Poetry Foundation and just, you know, type the name in here. James Baldwin, and then all of that writers' works, you know, that are in the Poetry Foundations come up. So this is the reason why I'm showing you this is because if you don't have the textbook or you can't access it or something like that, you can always come here or look online to see if you can access these poems outside of the textbook. But the reason I want to show you this Robert Browning one is because this Browning poem, not going to lie, it's a little bit of a challenge. Again, it's written, you know, like 1830 something. Let me see if it says. It doesn't have the date on here. It might have it in the text. But you know, it's pretty old. It's almost a 200-year-old poem. So the language is going to be different. The speaker, you know, is going to be unique to that time. The subject matter is going to be unique to that time. But some of these universal truths that we look for in literature are of course still going to be found. But one thing I want to show you is on some of these, not all of the Poetry Foundation ones, like if you look at the Flea, you don't see a little play button there. But if you go to Browning, you'll see a little play button here. And as you're reading the poem, you can follow along to a speaker.
That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder now. Frau Pandolf's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands.
Okay. that's going to be helpful to help you decipher, again, like the structure of the poem, the rhythm of the poem. The rhyme is very unique in this because there are rhymes right at the end of every line. But if you notice the way that it's read.
Will please you sit and look at her? I said Frau Pandolf by design, for never read strangers like you that pictured countenance.
Right? They don't, the speaker's sentences don't always end at those lines, right? So that's something we can think about in terms of rhythm and why Browning would construct the poem in this way. But remember that last thing I said about like the speaker not being the narrator. Once you figure out what's going on in this poem and who the speaker is and like what he's capable of, make sure you don't say that the speaker is Robert Browning. This is a character that Robert Browning created, right? Just like, you know, the Pahom and the devil, you know, Tolstoy is not Pahom. Pahom is a character that Tolstoy created to tell a story, right? The speaker, the Duke, we'll say, in this poem is not Robert Browning. A lot of times when we read poems, because it has that first person narrative sort of feel, we conflate that. We can't do that because some writers write memoirs, but most writers are taking on a persona. They're adopting a persona in their speaker and their narrator, who is not them, right? Who's a character they created. So where do you see these on the Poetry Foundation page? Again, make use of them. Do all the active reading strategies that I told you about in the Kafka and Tolstoy video. Keep doing those, right? Boxing unfamiliar words, defining rereading in context, looking at the title, pre-reading, maybe doing a little bit of research about the writer. But try not to just go straight to SparkNotes and have them tell you what it's about. Really, again, it's only 5 poems we have this week. Really do that work yourself to hunker down and to figure it out on your own, what the heck this is about. Because critical thinking is not regurgitating what somebody else told you it was, right? Critical thinking is you coming up with that yourself. That's part of interpretation, right? And analysis. So I hope this was helpful. I will have, you know, in my updates, like in the following weeks, I'll have like, oh yeah, this was about this or this happened. But I really want to see your interpretations of these poems, what you think of them, how you're evaluating them, how you're receiving them. So I hope you do that. I hope you have fun with it. Get weird, get creative. All right, well, that is it for today. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day and night. And I will see you in cyberspace. Bye.